So I'm doing a live public access television show out of his neighborhood. And as soon as the show ends, he bursts in, carrying this dirty potted plant. And he forces it into my arms, and he's emotional, nearly on the verge of tears. And he says, I'm here to just say I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I see you out there working for our people. I shouldn't have treated you that way. I shouldn't have treated you with that disrespect. I'm here to say I'm sorry. I would have bought you some flowers, but I'm still living at my grandma's. I snatched this plant off of her front porch here. hands me the plant, turns around and runs away. I chase after him. He jumps into a big beat-down car and disappears. Several months after that, I'm in my office, open up my newspaper, and what's on the front page? The Oakland Riders police scandal is broken. Turns out that a gang of officers, otherwise known as a drug task force, had been roaming his neighborhood, planting drugs on people, beating suspects up, and who is identified as the main officer, but the officer he had identified to me as having planted drugs on him and beat him up and his friend. And that's when the light bulb in my head finally started to go on, and I said to myself, he's right about me. I am no better than the police. The minute he told me he was a felon, I stopped listening. I couldn't hear what he had to say. And that was the beginning of me beginning to ask myself some hard questions as a civil rights lawyer. How was I actually replicating the very forms of discrimination, exclusion, and marginalization that I was supposedly fighting against? And I also started to question our strategies. I shouldn't have woken up just because he was innocent. The point is that there are millions of folks whose voices aren't being heard and whose stories are not being told because they've been branded criminals, branded felons. And we, as a nation, have decided they are unworthy of our care and concern. And that was the beginning of my journey of listening more carefully to the stories of people cycling in and out of prison, and also doing an enormous amount of research to try to understand why was it that we hadn't been able to find one young black man in his neighborhood they hadn't gotten to yet. What was really going on? And what I learned over those years blew my mind. I discovered that most of what I thought I knew about the criminal justice system was sheer myth. Here are the facts, a few of the facts I uncovered in the course of my work that I describe in the book. More African American adults are under correctional control today, in prison or jail, on probation or parole, than were enslaved in 1850, a decade before the Civil War began. In 2004, more black men were disenfranchised than in 1870, the year the 15th Amendment was ratified, prohibiting laws that deny the right to vote explicitly on the basis of race. Now, of course, during the Jim Crow era, poll taxes and literacy tests operated to keep black folks from the polls. Well, today, felon disenfranchisement laws accomplish what poll taxes and literacy tests ultimately could not. And today, a black child born today has less of a chance of being raised by both parents than a black child born during slavery. Now, this is due in large part to the mass incarceration of black men. There was an interesting article published in The Economist magazine about this not too long ago, entitled How the Mass Incarceration of Black Men Harms Black Women. And in the article, it described that the majority of black women in the United States, including about 70% of black professional women, are unmarried, and that this is due largely to the mass incarceration of black men, which takes them out of the dating pool at the years they would be most likely to commit to a partner, to raising a family. But what's worse is that by branding them criminals and felons, they're rendered permanently unemployable in the legal job market for the most part, virtually guaranteeing that most of them will cycle in and out of prison, sometimes for the rest of their lives. In this way, mass incarceration has decimated black families to a degree comparable to slavery. Now, in some major urban areas, more than half of working age African Americans of working age have criminal records and are thus subject to legalized discrimination for the rest of their lives. Let me correct that. More than half of working age black men in many urban areas have criminal records and are thus subject to legalized discrimination for the rest of their lives. These men are part of a growing undercaste, not class, caste, a group of people defined largely by race who are relegated to a permanent second-class status by law. Now, I find that when I tell people often that I think mass incarceration is like a new Jim Crow, people usually react with this shocked disbelief. They say, well, how can you say that? How can you say that? Just look at Barack Obama. You know, just look at Condoleezza Rice. Just look at Oprah Winfrey. Just look at Colin Powell. And the list goes on of highly successful, African Americans who have achieved great wealth, power, or fame as proof that nothing like a caste system could possibly be existing in the United States today. Well, I think it's important to bear in mind that no caste system in the United States has ever governed all African Americans. There have always been free blacks and black success stories, even during slavery and Jim Crow. During slavery, there were some black slave owners. Not many, but some. And during Jim Crow, there were some black lawyers and black doctors. Not many, but some. Now, the extraordinary nature of individual black achievement in formerly white domains certainly does suggest that the old Jim Crow is dead, but it doesn't necessarily mean the end of racial caste. If history is any guide, it may have just taken a different form. I think any honest observer of American racial history has to acknowledge that the rules and reasons the legal system employs for enforcing status relations evolve and change as they're challenged. In the first chapter of the book, I describe the cyclical rebirths of racial caste in America. Since our nation's founding, African Americans have repeatedly been controlled through institutions like slavery and Jim Crow, which appear to die, but then are reborn in new form, tailored to the needs and constraints of the time. For example, following the Civil War, a new system of control emerged to replace slavery, called convict leasing. Many people don't realize that after the Civil War, black men were arrested en masse. It was our nation's first prison boom. They were arrested for extremely minor crimes like loitering and vagrancy. They were arrested, sent to prison, and then leased to plantations. Sometimes the very plantations from which they had been freed or their parents had been freed. Now, the idea was that they were supposed to earn their freedom, but the catch was they could never earn enough to pay back the plantation owner the cost of their food, clothing, or shelter to the plantation owner's satisfaction, and so they were effectively re-enslaved, sometimes for the rest of their lives. Douglas Blackman has written an excellent book about this phenomenon called Slavery by Another Name, about the rebirth of slavery in the South following the Civil War. Well, I believe our criminal justice system has been used once again to effectively recreate caste in America. Now, I'm sure there's at least one person, probably more, in this room who's thinking, what is she talking about? Our criminal justice system isn't a caste system, it's a system of crime control. If black folks would just stop committing so many crimes, they wouldn't have to worry about being rounded up, locked up, and stripped of their basic civil and human rights. And therein lies the biggest myth about mass incarceration, namely that it's been driven by crime or crime rates. It's not true. It's absolutely not true. Our prison population quintupled in 30 years, went from about 350,000 to well over 2 million for reasons that have stunningly little to do with crime or crime rates. Over the past 30 years, crime rates have fluctuated, have gone up, have gone down. Today, as bad as they are in many parts of the country, crime rates are actually at historical lows. But incarceration rates have consistently soared, especially Black incarceration rates. Most criminologists and sociologists today will acknowledge that crime rates and incarceration rates in the United States have moved independently of one another. Incarceration rates have soared regardless of whether crime was going up or down in any given community or the nation as a whole. So what does explain this explosion in incarceration, in Black and brown incarceration in the United States, if not crime rates? Well, the answer is the war on drugs and the Get Tough movement, the wave of punitiveness that washed over the United States. In fact, drug convictions alone accounted for about 2/3 of the increase in the federal system and more than half of the increase in the state system between 1985 and 2000, the period of the drug war's greatest escalation. Now, to get a sense of how large a contribution the drug war has made to mass incarceration, consider this. There are more people in prison and jail today just for drug offenses than were incarcerated for all reasons in 1980. Drug convictions have increased more than 1,000% since the drug war began. And here in New York City, where possession of marijuana is supposedly decriminalized, more than 50,000 people were arrested for marijuana possession just last year. 536,000 people have been arrested for marijuana possession since 1996, sweeping extraordinary numbers of people into the criminal justice system, right here in a city that has supposedly decriminalized marijuana possession. Now, most Americans violate drug laws in their lifetime. Most do. But the enemy in this war has been racially defined. The drug war, not by accident, has been waged almost exclusively in poor communities of color, despite the fact that studies have now shown for decades that people of color are no more likely to use or sell illegal drugs than whites, or sell. Now that defies our basic stereotype of who a drug dealer is, as some, Black kid standing on the street corner with his pants sagging down. And plenty of drug dealing happens in the hood, but it happens everywhere else in America as well. A kid living in rural Kansas doesn't drive to the hood to get his marijuana or his meth or his cocaine. No, he gets it most likely from someone of his own race down the road. In fact, where significant differences in the data can be found, they frequently suggest that white youth are more likely to engage in illegal drug dealing than Black youth. But that's not what you would guess by taking a peek inside our nation's prisons and jails, which are overflowing with Black and brown drug offenders. In some states, 80 to 90% of all drug offenders sent to prison have been African American. Now, here in New York City, thanks to stop and frisk tactics in poor communities of color, where police sweep neighborhoods, stopping, interrogating, frisking folks without any reasonable suspicion of actual criminal activity, young folks of color are often caught with a small amount of marijuana, arrested, sent to jail, and saddled with a criminal record that will follow them for the rest of their lives. Now, this didn't happen to Barack Obama when he used marijuana and cocaine. No, because he did so at predominantly white universities where these stop and frisk tactics don't ever occur. But if you're not living in a middle-class white neighborhood, if you're not on a college campus or university insulated from the tactics of this war, if you're living in the hood, your odds of going to jail are sky high for engaging in exactly the same kind of behavior that goes ignored on the other side of town.